One of the cool things about creating network policies for access through a remote access server is that we can leverage Active Directory. For example, if we have a group of users, so we create an Active Directory group, we can specify group membership as a condition that has to exist for that policy to match. We also have options inside the individual properties of a user account in Active Directory regarding dial-in. The default position is to let NPS, Network Policy Server, control access or not through the policies. However, we can manually specify to allow or deny dial-in access at the user level. We also have the option of ignoring the dial-in settings for a user if we want to force the rules as part of the network policy to be enforced through NPS. So we'll begin here on our Windows 10 client, and let's right-click on the Windows icon in the bottom left-hand corner, and from the menu select Network Connections. And let's also disable our inside interface called Inside-192 by right-clicking on that interface and selecting Disable from the menu. And that leaves us with the one outside interface so we can actually start building our VPNs. It would also be great before we start playing with policy is to verify that our existing VPNs do work. So let's go ahead and double-click on one of our VPN connections. That'll bring up our settings for VPN. And then let's go ahead and use the IPv4 L2TP-IPsec as an example. So we'll click on that and then click on Connect. So that works, that's great. Let's go ahead and click on Disconnect, and let's also verify that PPTP still works. So we'll go ahead and click on PPTP, click on Connect, and, and that doesn't work, and that's based on how we left it in the last nugget. So let's do this. Let's go into our policies for the network policy server, and let's make sure that we're starting off with PPTP also working. So let's go head over to Server 2. So here on Server 2, we'll go to Tools, and from the drop-down, we'll select Network Policy Server. And here in Network Policy Server, we'll expand the Policy section and go to Network Policies. There's your problem right there. So we have a network policy that says yes to L2TP and nothing else for PPTP to possibly have a chance with. So let's go ahead and create a special policy just for PPTP. So to expedite that, let's duplicate the yes to L2TP and just tweak that. So we'll right-click on yes to L2TP. From the drop-down, we'll select Duplicate Policy. And there's our copy of yes to L2TP. It's currently disabled. So what we'll do is let's go ahead and double-click on copy of yes to L2TP. We'll rename this. Let's call it yes to PPTP. We'll click the checkbox next to Policy Enabled to enable the policy. We'll make sure that Grant Access is selected, and then we'll go to the Conditions. And for Conditions, we'll go ahead and select the tunnel type. We'll double-click on it, and we'll remove the check next to L2TP and put a check next to PPTP. Fantastic. And we'll click on OK. And then we'll click on OK again. So great. Now we've got a policy of yes to L2TP and yes to PPTP. So every client that gets past a connection request policy, when they get to the network policy here, the system is going to check the first policy to see if there's a match. And if there's not a match, then the next policy until there's a match. And if there's no match anywhere, the client goes hungry. Bow, bow, bow. So now that we have our PPTP policy, let's go to our client and verify it works. So at the client, we'll go ahead and click on Connect for the PPTP connection. And it is working. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and disconnect it. And let's go back to the server. And what I'd like to do is let's create yet one more policy. And to create a new policy, let's choose the connection to Microsoft Routing and Remote Access Server. Right-click on that one and duplicate that policy. So then we'll double-click on that copy that we just created. And let's name this Member of RA Group. Let's enable the policy by putting a check in that box next to Policy Enabled. And let's grant access. And then we'll click on the Conditions tab and we'll specify the conditions. Now the conditions we're looking for is anybody who's a member of that group, which just occurred to me, we need to create that group. So let's go over to DCNUG to create that group. So here on DCNUG, we'll go ahead and launch Server Manager. There's an icon on the taskbar for that. And from Server Manager, we'll click on Tools, and from the drop-down, we'll select Active Directory Users and Computers. And let's create a new group. So we could right-click and create a new group, or use this icon up here to create a new group. And let's go ahead and call the group RA4U. And we'll click on OK to create that group. And because I currently have the username of administrator on all the VPN connection profiles, let's go ahead and put the administrator in that group. So we'll go ahead and double-click on RA4U. And click on Members, and click on Add, and let's type in Admin. Click on Check Names. There's Administrator, and we'll click on OK. And then we'll click on OK again. Great. Also, hey, you know what? Since we're right here in Active Directory, let me also point out this group called RAS and IAS servers. And IAS stands for the Internet Authentication Service, which is the service we used to use for features similar to NPS now. In any event, as part of this group, if we go to members of this group, as part of setting up the remote access, there's an authorization for the server to be a remote access server. And one of the things that it does, it takes that server and it puts it as a member of this group called RAS and IAS servers. So if in the event that you were logged on locally on a server and doing an installation of a role like remote access, and there was a message indicating that we needed to authorize this as a remote access server in Active Directory, we'd want to make sure we came back and added the server here as a member of this group. Or in routing and remote access, you could right click and then use the drop down menu to go ahead and authorize the computer, which would put it in this group. All right, a little bit of a tangent there, but since it was right there, I wanted to show you. So click on cancel. And now we have this group called RA for you. And as a member of that RA for you, we have the administrator. Fantastic. So let's go back to server 2 and configure our network policy to look for group membership in that group as a condition. So here on server 2, if we click on overview, just remember what policy we're looking at, the policy called member of RA group, and we go to conditions again. And now if we click on add, we can go ahead and specify lots of things as conditions, including user groups. So if we double click on user groups and click on add groups, and let's go ahead and type in RA and click on check names. So we have a couple groups that begin with RA. We have the RAS and IAS servers group, and we also have the RA for you group, and that's the one we want. That's the one the administrator is a member of. So with RA for you selected, we'll click on OK. And then we'll click on OK again, and OK one more time. So now the conditions for this policy include group membership in RA for you. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. And let's also move that to the top of the list. So we'll right click on member of RA group and select move up. And we'll do it one more time. We'll right click and select move up so it's at the top of the heap. It's in position number 1. So just for grins, if we wanted to disable the L2TP and PPTP specifically, we could select those, right click and select disable for each of those. So they're no longer going to be considered as part of the policy. And that's just another great way to verify that the first policy right here, the member of RA group, is actually the one that's giving the VPN client its access into the network. So with the member of RA group there, let's go ahead and test our connectivity. So we'll go back to our client. So here on the client, let's go ahead and grab our IPv4 L2TP connection and click on connect. And that is working. So we'll go ahead and disconnect. And just as a sanity check, let's go back to the server for a moment. And here at the server, let's go ahead and disable that member of RA group policy at the very top by right-clicking on it and selecting disable from the dropdown. So let's give the server a few moments to process that. And let's go back to the client now and verify that we cannot get access. So here at the client, for the IPv4 L2TP IPsec connection, we'll go ahead and click on connect, and it fails. That's fantastic. And all of our connections should now fail because we don't have any network policies that are permitting access. And the reason I wanted to demonstrate this was because we can actually go into user properties and we can say, forget about NPS, just do what it says right here under the dial-in properties. Case in point, let's go back up to DCNUG and take a look at the properties of the administrator account. So here on DCNUG, using the Active Directory Users and Computers Manager, let's go ahead and double click on Administrator to take a look at the properties of Administrator. Let's click on Dial-In, the Dial-In tab, and by default, we're doing control access through NPS network policy. Now if we wanted to, we could do this, allow access, which basically says, hey, don't bother checking on the whole NPS policy thing, just allow access. So with that selected, we'll go ahead and click on Apply. And let's go back to our client and now test the VPN connection that just a moment ago failed due to the network policy. So back here at the client, we'll go ahead and click on Connect. And now it's in no problem. And let's go ahead and disconnect and just connect one more time to make sure it's really happening. Fantastic, it is. So let's go back to the properties of the administrator up on DCNUG. So back at DCNUG, still looking at the properties of administrator, we also have similar treatment for deny access, which would deny access to this user in spite of whatever network policies might be there. Of course, we have the default action here of control access through NPS network policy. Let me show you one other really kind of cool thing, and that is, let's imagine that this administrator account has allow access, which is ignoring the NPS policies. So with that in place, the allow access, we'll click on OK. Then we'll go back to our client and just verify that it still works. We'll do our connect. Still works, great, no problem. And let's go back to our network policy, and we can actually ignore that dial-in setting that's associated with the user account. So to demonstrate this, let's create one more policy. We'll right click on yes to L2TP. We'll duplicate that one, double click on it to edit it, and we'll call this no. And with that policy, we'll enable it, we'll deny access. And for the conditions, we'll go ahead and remove the tunnel type. And I'll leave the vendor being a Microsoft Remote Access Server. So effectively, anybody that matches this policy should be denied access. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. And we could move this up to the top if we wanted to, but it's not really going to matter because the policies in position 1, 2, and 3 currently are all disabled. So because administrator for the dial-in properties is still set for allow, if we go to our client and we try to connect, it's still going to work because of the user attribute for allow regarding dial-in. And we have one more trick up our sleeve, and that is this. Let's disconnect here and let's go back to server 2. On server 2, for this policy called no, if we double click on that, one of the options we have on the overview tab, besides enabling the policy and granting or denying access, we also have this checkbox right here to ignore user account dial-in properties. It basically says, I don't care if it says allow there or deny there. Doesn't matter. This policy, if it's a match, is going to be enforced. And because the conditions for this policy are matching anybody who connects over the VPN, that's going to apply to our clients, including the administrator, and it's going to deny him access because we just added this little check next to ignore user account dial-in properties. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. Then we'll go back to our client. We'll test our VPN connection one more time, and now it's failing. And that's because we have a network policy in place. It's being matched. That policy says no access. And it's also set for not caring what's set at the user level regarding dial-in permissions. And before I leave this lab, let me go back and leave it so it's going to be working for the next lab. So let's go back to server 2. And for server 2, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to disable the no policy by right-clicking on it. And then from the drop-down, selecting disable. And I'm going to enable the yes to L2TP and the yes to PPTP by right-clicking on them and selecting enable on each of them respectively. And I'm also going to go back to DC-nug. And here on the domain controller, I'm going to go to the properties of the administrator under dial-in and specify that we do want to use NPS to control access. And the reason I'm doing that now is because in the next nugget, it's going to save me some troubleshooting if something doesn't work because of a policy or a setting from this nugget. All right, so we'll click on OK. And now, my friend, I encourage you to do the hands-on practice to reinforce the concepts and see the direct impact of changing the attributes in the group membership in Active Directory and how those can affect the network policy as part of NPS. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.